Mergers and acquisitions transactions are inherently very, very complex and complicated matters. So the first and perhaps most straightforward alternative in terms of structuring a business would be a stock purchase transaction whereby a buyer acquires all of the equity or stock of a target business. Alternatively, buyer and seller may consider an asset purchase transaction whereby a buyer will acquire all or selected assets of a target business. And finally, the parties may alternatively consider a statutory merger transaction whereby, by operation of law, the buyers and sellers' businesses are combined. Buyers and sellers typically will have competing legal and business interests in mind when negotiating the structure of a transaction. In order to maximize value, it's vital that buyers and sellers alike engage experienced legal counsel to help them address and negotiate important material issues in structuring a transaction. 4 areas of major concern that buyers and sellers need to be mindful of in negotiating the structure of a business. The first is transferability of liabilities. Depending on the type of structure that's used, those liabilities may or may not be transferred to a buyer. So another very important area of concern is what approvals are required in connection with a transaction. It's very important that all of those agreements be carefully reviewed to understand what the contractual provisions in those agreements say with respect to assignability of those agreements. Now, the structure of the transaction can determine whether those contractual provisions are in fact relevant at the end of the day. The other area where consent is important to be mindful of is, do you need the consent of the owners of the selling business? Typically, the transaction structure will be relevant to that analysis also. So under a stock purchase transaction, clearly unanimity is pretty important. If you're buying all the stock of a business, you need everyone to play along. Maybe that's not an issue if you only have a small handful of stockholders, but if you have a very large, diffuse stockholder base, perhaps you can't even find or locate some of the stockholders, or maybe every stockholder is not on the same page. Some are in favor of the deal, others aren't. A stock purchase transaction could be problematic. Obviously, tax considerations are very important to both buyers and sellers when they're negotiating the structure of a business. Typically, the structure of the transaction will result in immediate tax consequences for both buyers and sellers. So in an asset purchase transaction, it's really ideal for a buyer because a buyer is going to get what's called a step up in basis in the assets of the assets that they acquire from seller, and they'll be able to depreciate those assets over time and thus be more profitable post-closing. That's not a good situation for sellers because the selling corporation is going to pay a tax on the assets that are sold, and then when that money is left over and dividended out to the to the owners rather of the selling business, they're going to be taxed a second time. So it's a 2-level of taxation, which is not ideal for the sellers in a business. Conversely, a merger transaction, oftentimes, especially if some of the consideration that's paid in connection with the transaction is in the form of the stock of the buying business, oftentimes the taxation on those proceeds can be deferred over time, and sellers can delay the tax hit of that type of a transaction. And finally, for a stock purchase transaction, that's really ideal in many ways for the sellers in a business because especially if they've held their stock for more than a year, they'll be taxed at a long-term capital gains rate. Conversely, for the buyer in a stock purchase transaction, they're not going to get the same write-up in basis that they would if it was an asset purchase transaction. And so, again, competing interests there, what is necessarily good for the sellers in a transaction from a tax perspective is not ideal for the buyers. So we at Morse, Barnes, Brown & Pendleton have been very active in the M&A space. In the last year alone, we've represented buyers and sellers on 29 M&A transactions. And I think this experience in a vast array of different industries and business sectors uniquely positions us to have a very, very informed and educated perspective for our clients in terms of deal terms, structure considerations, valuations, and other important issues for our clients that they're looking to us for our expertise when we're representing clients in those transactions.